Welcome. My name is Nakia Hoskins. I'm the External Engagement Coordinator for the University Libraries. It is with great pleasure and a high honor that I welcome you, whether you are engaged in person or virtually connected to your computer, to a much needed conversation that I've personally been anticipating since Victoria Walters extended the invitation to the libraries to partner with in discussing author and abolitionist Deshaun L. Harrison's Belly of the Beast, the Politics of Anti-Fatness is Anti-Blackness. So welcome, Deshaun. Again, as I was about to say, in all of my personal training with equity, diversity, and inclusion, thus far, your book has been the first space and the first unmuted mic where topics that you write about have even been brought to the forefront or even thought of. So for that, I thank you. Your presence is welcome. Again, I thank Victoria for the opportunity to engage with our campus and the community that our campus serves. Everyone, again, you are welcome. Thank you for tuning in today. I welcome your bravery. I welcome your transparency, and I welcome your contributions to creating this to be a safe space for today's conversation. So again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nakia. We would like to offer a warm welcome to Deshaun L. Harrison, and I'll tell y'all a little bit about our author here. So Deshaun L. Harrison, who uses they, them pronouns, is a Black, fat, disabled, queer, and trans writer. They're also an abolitionist and community organizer based in Atlanta, Georgia. Harrison has worn and continues to wear many hats: communications director, editor-in-chief, associate editor, managing editor, lead organizer, and now author. Harrison travels throughout the United States and abroad to lecture at conferences and colleges and to lead workshops focused on Blackness, queerness, gender, class, disabilities, fatness, and the intersection at which they all meet. You can find Deshaun on Twitter and Instagram at Deshaun LH or through their website, DeshaunHarrison.com. So welcome, Deshaun. Additionally, we would like to thank all of our sponsors for making this event possible. So the School of Nursing, the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Social Work, Dr. Yarnisha Dyson's Research Lab, the Office of Leadership and Civic Engagement, the Office of Campus Activities and Programs, the Counseling English, the School of Education, the Honors College, the Department of Kinesiology, and the Kinesiology DEI program. And a very special thank you to Nakia Hoskins and the University Libraries. Without your help, we would not have been able to provide this pivotal conversation. So thank you. All right, we're gonna jump right into it, Deshaun. We're gonna do this in a very conversational manner because I really feel like you have let us in throughout this book. And so we're friends in my head. So let's make it happen.
Wait, before we start, can we do like a check-in, right? Just how are you doing, right? How are you doing in the context of COVID? How are you doing in the context of this week, in the context of today? And can we do an outfit check? Victoria shows it off more than I can, but these shirts were especially made for the programming that she and her office brought forth. So thank Victoria and Deshaun. I think one is on the way for you. So send a picture back in your Black History Month OIE shirt. But yeah, how are you?
Yeah, thank you for one, both of you for those beautiful words, for reading the bio, and just for inviting me to this space. I'm very grateful for that. I want to give a shout out really quickly to my new space of work, Scalawag Magazine. The bio that was read, I forgot to update it before sending it over to Victoria. So just want to say, like, Scalawag is a brilliant space dedicated to Southerners and political engagement. So I serve now as editor at large for Scalawag Magazine. And I am doing okay. COVID very much has, changed the game. It really has changed like the ways that all of us show up in the world. And that has been still, almost 3 years later, has been just such a struggle to adjust to. But I have adjusted, and I'm grateful for the fact that, we are here, and we are still able to do so much in a world that is constantly, I feel like, trying to take us out. So I'm grateful, and I hope that y'all are doing okay too. And yes, my shirt is on the way. I can't wait to get it, or I might get it in April. I don't know, but I'm excited to wear it regardless.
Thank you so much for that. We're excited to that you would honor us in wearing our shirt. We also want to say for all of you all in the house today, thank you so much for keeping your mask on and for also being socially distanced from those of whom you didn't come with. So we really appreciate that. All right, so Deshaun, what was the experience writing this book?
So writing this book, this is, for those who don't know, my very first book. Is my debut title. So that means that I've never written a book before. And I signed my contract for the book maybe 2 or 3 days before we went on lockdown in Atlanta. So I wrote this book in the middle of the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, as well as the uprisings that took place over the summer of 2020. So writing this book was tough, right? I was working at the time with Warrior Voice magazine, and was also working as lead organizer for an organization here, for an organization in Atlanta, as community organizer. So there was so much work that I was doing on the ground versus, digitally through my work online, as well as through the magazine and my writing, while also trying to write a book. So it was very difficult. But for me, I also think that it was very necessary. So much about what I write in the book were things that were also really evident in the ways that we were like navigating 2020, right? There was a lot happening with the ways that the CDC, WHO, and other organizations were interacting with Black folks and fat folks in particular, specifically around quote unquote obesity. Of course, we saw all of the uprisings that happened in response to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And so, those things were very relevant to chapters 3, 4, and 5 of my book. And so I think that, while it was a very difficult thing to navigate, because I was really in my bag trying to be focused on all of my work and also meet a deadline that I signed through a contract, while also trying to adjust in this new world that we're having to live in. So it was tough, but it was definitely a learning experience. And, it's not something that I think I would do differently. It brought me to a project that I'm very proud of. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you should. As we're talking about, the book, definitely have invited people here. We actually started a book club here on the campus. So we do have some book club members. Shout out to the book club. But some people are here who may not have ever picked up your book. So do you mind giving a brief overview of what you did write about and, the mission of Belly of the Beast?
Yes. So for one, thank you for starting this book club. That's exciting. And I'm very interested in hearing from some of the folks and what that's been like. But so for folks who don't know, I wrote a book titled Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness. And what this book was supposed to do was provide, or act rather, as an intervention in fat studies, Black studies, and women, gender, sexuality studies, as all three of these disciplines are separate entities that I don't think necessarily have produced work that acknowledges the ways that so many of us exist at the intersections of all of those identities. And beyond that, fat studies in particular has a very heavy focus on cisgender heterosexual white women, and doesn't account for the varying ways that Blackness plays a significant role in anti-fatness, right? Anti-fatness exists because of anti-Blackness, which is what I'm arguing in my book. And so outside of, very pivotal texts like Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Serena Strings, and And of course, you have memoirs like Heavy and Hunger by Kiese Layman and Roxane Gay, and then work from Sonia Renee Taylor. There are not really many texts that really focus on fat Black folks in particular. Also, shout out to Andrea Shaw, who wrote her book in 2006, long before any of the rest of us. And so I think that for me, it was very important that I write a book that centered the Black fat trans experience, be it trans mask or non-binary mask individuals, to be able to sort of introduce a very different conversation into the fat studies lexicon, and to be able to bridge a gap between all of these disciplines that are necessary and really important disciplines, but that oftentimes operate in very separate playing fields, while so many of us exist at the helm of all of these identities. So the book travels through, if you will, 7 different topics under the general topic of anti-fatness as anti-Blackness. So I'm working through body positivity and the harms of body positivity. I'm working through desirability and beauty politics. I'm working through health as an anti-Black concept, an anti-fat concept. I'm working through the anti-Black, anti-fatness of police murders, specifically in the US, of Black folks. I'm talking about the sort of connection between the war on drugs and the war on obesity, and how those things connect, and also talking about gender and the ways that anti-fatness, or rather the way that gender and anti-fatness sort of work together, to create a very difficult world for Black trans mask folks and Black non-binary folks. And then at the end, I am sort of petitioning the reader, or demanding, or offering a demand rather, around moving us beyond abolition, right? Moving us, understanding abolition as a beginning and not an end. Understanding abolition as sort of the start of something else versus the end as it oftentimes is spoken about. And so this book sort of borrows from varying political ideologies, like communism, like Afro-pessimism, like Black feminism, and it cites folks that I think have just been very pivotal in the disciplines that I named earlier on, who have provided really necessary texts to be able to move the conversation forward. And I wanted to offer just a different take on anti-fatness by naming that anti-fatness is anti-Blackness. They function as the same. And before this book, that has not been done. So it was just a very necessary text for me to be able to put out. And that sort of is a brief synopsis on what I'm trying to do with the book and what's happening in those 7 chapters.
Thank you so much for that. And I will say, like myself, as a Black, fat, queer person, finding your work, especially in finding the work of other peers of yours, such as Hunter Shackelford, really transformed my way of looking at myself and my experience. And so as soon as you tweeted that you had a book, I was like, all right, cool, let's pre-order, let's do that. And for me, you've really created spaces for me to think really deeply about things that I think we're kind of shamed out of talking about, right? So in chapter 1, you talk about insecurity and how it is a reasonable response to a violent system, and how we should really view insecurity as not as something bad, but as something that we should actually lean into, and that it should inform our politic. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So what led me to this thought and this conclusion was that I was reflecting one day about how often, in particular, fat Black folks are, especially online, but also in real life, or offline, rather, I should say, are often bullied for talking about our experiences. And oftentimes when that happens, it's named that we are quote unquote jealous, right, of the individuals that we are talking about, or the individuals who don't share our experiences, those being, thin, lighter skinned, and or white individuals with quote unquote gym bodies or who are in the sort of fitness realm. And it forced me to sit with this idea that if people are jealous or insecure about their bodies, and their insecurity stems from the fact that there are clearly like social, cultural, political, economic benefits to looking like the opposite of what they do, then those insecurities are not born of themselves. They're born of the world that creates the conditions for them. And if that is the case, there's something to be more deeply interrogated there around the ways that our insecurities are sort of a response to the violences that we experience in the world. And if that is the case, if our insecurities are a response to what we experience in the world, then perhaps it's best that we not blame ourselves for these insecurities and run away from them or pretend that they don't exist, and rather lean into them to be able to inform our politic, not as a way to inform our praxis, right? But as a way to inform our understanding of the world. Why am I insecure, right? What has led me to these feelings about my body? And if that thing is that I recognize that someone who looks different than me benefits in very particular ways over me, right? Because of this beautiful, ugly dichotomy in the world that I also write about in chapter 2, then there's something inherently political about insecurity. And if that is the case, then there's more to be talked about there than just tossing it up to you're just jealous or you're just insecure and making that something that's bad on the individual and not on the world in which those conditions are created.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because one of my favorite quotes in the book, it says, you can't beat people down forever and expect that they never feel the effects of that continued beating, right? And that was used as a defense to self-love, right? If you love yourself enough, then that's going to be the answer to the problem. And so it leads us to a question that someone asks. When discussing self-love, it seems that cis, white, able-bodied folks never engage in that conversation. It seems to be mostly marginalized people that engage in those conversations. Is the concept of self-love not necessary for cis, white, able-bodied people to have because of their privilege and access to power?
I think this is like a complicated question, because I actually see a lot of cis, white, able-bodied people engage in the conversation around self-love, but I think that oftentimes those conversations are produced by people of marginalized experiences. So for example, a lot of white, cis, able-bodied folks that I see engaging in conversations around self-love are people who are arriving at that conversation through reading Sonia Renee Taylor's work, The Body's Not an Apology. And so I think that in some ways, yeah, I don't think that they have to necessarily have those conversations because their identities are always already the embodiment of love, which I then think has to become a critique about what love is and love as also a form of violence. But that's a different conversation. And so, yes, I think that a lot of times people who exist in these experiences, in these bodies, do not have to engage in conversations like that. And the reasons for why they arrive at those conversations because of marginalized people's experiences that lead them there is an example of exactly that truth, right? Is that they only come to know these things even exist, or that these conversations even have to happen because someone else, someone who's Black, who's fat, who's disabled, etc., is having to bring those conversations to the forefront. But I think that the reasons for why we even have to have these conversations, right? The reason for why we believe self-love as a praxis or as a sort of motto is something that's liberatory or revolutionary or an answer, is because of whiteness. And so therefore, like the very thing that strips people of their ability to to love themselves, right? Or to see themselves as worthy of love, but also that then places the onus on them to love themselves out of structural violence is whiteness and anti-Blackness. And so I think that what that really says is that these folks are unaware of these conversations because their whiteness protects them from the ability to, or rather from them being required to see the ways that their own bodies, their embodiment of whiteness, forces that conversation to be had. One thing that I have said in the book, I believe, and that I have talked about since the book's release, is that whiteness helps to sustain these structures. And so in that way, the very sort of embodiment of white folks living in white bodies, right, is the thing that helps to maintain these very same structures. It is the thing that helps to maintain whiteness as a concept and anti-Blackness, therefore, as a concept. So yes, I think that the question is complicated, but the overall gist of it is that, yeah, I think white folks, white able-bodied, thin folks, are able to oftentimes ignore these conversations unless they're being led by marginalized folks, because their whiteness allows them to. Their whiteness provides them the space to be able to ignore those things for as long as they can, and they choose to do so. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think also about the relationship that we have with our body. Why is it necessary that we love this vessel that we are in order to get through the oppression that we are facing or in the violence that we are experiencing? And what would you say should our relationships, or should we strive for our relationships with our bodies to be like? Should it be body neutrality instead of body positivity?
So I actually have critiques of body neutrality too, which I know is like, oh, what don't you have critiques of? But so I think that the reason why I have a critique of body neutrality is because I think that under an anti-Black, anti-fat world, believing that being neutral about fat bodies is something that benefits fat people, it's something that is just as harmful as body positivity and anti-fatness. I think that it is also another sort of iteration of benevolent anti-fatness in so many ways. And so I think that, you know, what we should strive for with our relationships to our bodies, particularly for fat Black folks, is I do think that this is very individualistic. In my mind, I think that so I'm going to speak for myself and not speak for a whole. I strive every day to find more reasons to love or to honor or to provide grace to my body, to hold my body in the ways that it deserves, while also giving myself enough grace to understand that some days I will hate it because of the world that I live in, right? And I think that is what I'm always striving for, striving to desire my body more often, and also being graceful enough to understand that there will be some days where that won't be true. And I don't like to necessarily label it as body neutral, because what I'm always trying to get to is the outright celebration of fat bodies, because I think that anything less than the outright celebration of fat bodies under an anti-fat, anti-Black world is violent. And so that's sort of how I arrived to that. And I also see this question here asking if body neutrality is akin to color blindness. And I'm going to say yes, in so many ways, right? Like it's this idea that, you know, that you're going to be neutral about what people look like, as if we don't know that people show up with different bodies every day and that people are treated differently depending on what that body looks like. So I don't want to be engaged as though there's something neutral about my body. There isn't. There's something that is very much not neutral about this body, and I'm striving to that being the opposite, because I think that is what destroys anti-fatness.
Sorry, speechless.
I'm sitting here just like I'm putting two and two together, and I'm getting six right now, because I'm like trying to think of like how I can be so clear about conversations about colorblindness and how that's not the answer at all, and that is erasing the experiences that dark-skinned people, and particularly dark-skinned Black people, the violence that they experience, that we experience, versus seeing body neutrality for me for a while was really, this feels more like an answer. I don't have to love this vessel if I am able to see it as the space that I occupy in this world. But that in and of itself is not allowing me to fully be present and to fully be not just tolerated or accepted, but celebrated. So you've broken my brain, but we're gonna get through it.
Yeah, so I will also bring up that one, thank you for introducing this body neutrality, right, is akin to color blindness. Also, going back to your book, I thank you for introducing, I think, a topic, again, that doesn't have a lot of space to be fleshed out, was you talked about early on just how masculine expressed, like that bodies are often hypersexualized, introduced to sex at an early age, and, you know, policed. How has that been? Because I know for a lot of my friends, whether they identify masculine male through expression, they don't talk about the instances that you bring up about how they feel with their bodies and how that often collides with what society tells them to feel about them. But again, going back to origins of when they were first introduced to their bodies as a sexual being, how has that discussion been for you, both in realizing it to write it and then have written it and now talked about?
Oh, I love this question. So I will always point back to him because I just think that his memoir is so brilliant. Kiese Layman is who really did like something wonderful for me, who like helped me to really get clear of exactly how that worked when he talked about his experience in his memoir. And I was like, this makes so much sense. And it wasn't something I had actually considered prior to reading that book, but it made so much sense. And I think that the conversation, being able to write about this and speak about this in this way, I think is so important, because I think oftentimes, particularly cis men, try to use this type of conversation to undercut typically women and their experiences with sexual violence. And that is not the answer to to that, and not how to navigate that conversation. And so for me, it was very important that I was able to provide an analysis that allowed people to, and really, I mean, cis men are part of this, but they weren't my focus. My focus again was trans masc folks and non-binary folks in this piece. So my hope was that people would be able to move through this conversation in a way that allowed for them to contend with the fact that their body was introduced to them as a sexual thing, while also acknowledging the ways that perhaps they have reproduced that very same violence for other people, even if unknowingly. So when I read Kiese's work, it was, for me, something that made this conversation easier. And that led me to that piece of the book where I was able to name, right, that in particular, fat Black folks are oftentimes fat Black children, I'm going to say more specifically, are oftentimes hypersexualized. And because of the ways that they are taught to believe themselves to be undesirable, to believe themselves to be ugly, to believe themselves to be people undeserving of love, care, and all the things that come along with what desirable or beautiful people are taught, that touch, right? That non-consensual touch, that removal of agency from their bodies, is something that feels welcoming. It's something that feels correct and right, which oftentimes then leads and teaches people to believe that that is the type of touch for them to accept, but not only accept, but also to give to others, right? Because if this touch feels affirming to me, if this touch feels welcoming to me, then that must be the touch that is also welcoming and affirming for other people. And I wanted to be able to bridge a gap between rape culture, anti-fatness, and anti-Blackness that make, and also transphobia, that made clear that the ways that these things function are, again, not separate entities. They operate together, they function together. And when they do so, they create the conditions for sexual violence to be a continuous practice, or a practice rather, because we are not interrogating it as deeply as we could be, and as honestly and earnestly as we should be. And so, yeah, for me, it was a very, very, very important thing to include, because I think that it's always important to talk about the ways that fat Black boys, in many ways, are hypersexualized, and believe, and that being believed to be okay, because of their boyhood or what's assigned to them, and therefore not recognizing them as people who can be victims, but also how that then creates a cycle and becomes a very cyclical form of violence in the space.
Thank you for that. I also think about the adultification of Black children in general, period. And then adding yet that other layer of when it is a fat Black child. So now, not only are they seen as an adult, not only are they hypersexualized, but I also think about how that impacts their experiences in schools, their experiences with school police officers and administrators, or those who are serving in some sort of carceral form, and how that impacts how they're seen as responsible for the actions that are happening around them. So thank you so much for that. In your book, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to say really quickly that I love that, because yes, I think that, we oftentimes talk about the school to prison pipeline, but I think that so much of that also does not talk about the ways that rape culture plays a significant role in that. And of course, misogynoir for Black girls too. And so I just love that you made that connection, because that really absolutely plays a significant role in that. And what I wrote about in that first or second chapter in the book with regards to this, is that so often, at least in my experience, and I know for a lot of other fat Black folks who were socialized as boys, it's a very complex, very complicated relationship to sexual violence, right? Because the sexualization of our bodies is about the ways that our bodies are read as things that belong to women, Black women in particular, but that are understood to be things that come with the very protections of what it means to be a man, and therefore not speak about these things, that then does not leave us as vulnerable as what people perceive to be true for Black women, right? So I can harm you because I feel like I am assaulting the body of a Black woman, right? But I also know that this comes with you not disclosing this information, because there's a particular level of a taboo nature that comes along with talking about sexual violence as it relates to Black boys and Black men. And I think that plays a very significant role, and therefore is something important to talk about, because what I hope that it does for cis Black men and other folks who are socialized as boys, as children, that it helps them be clear about the fact that misogynoir is something that affects all of us, and it's something that should bother all of us, even though it's very specific to Black women. And that when we don't have an analysis on misogynoir, we are also lacking an analysis on our lives and our experiences.
Yes, all of that. Wow. I also think about how when we say, things like feminism is for everybody and that colorism affects us all, that misogynoir affects us all, that really kind of heads back to our communal responsibility to and for each other.
Right.
You have worked as a community organizer. Can you talk about what finding community and camaraderie in your existence as a fat Black trans person has been like, and how that community, that building community and finding community in that has been for you?
Yes. So for me, organizing became a home for me. I found so much of my own self through organizing. I started organizing in 2014, and after I started school at Morehouse, and while there is when I discovered myself as this trans queer person that I had never really known myself to be prior to, or that I'd never named myself as such prior to. And I found a lot of community with other Black, trans, and queer folks who were doing the same work that I was doing, both internally and through, organizing, community organizing. But I think that something that is and has been missing from movement in general is a space where we understand fatness as a marginalized experience. And so there is, even in movement spaces, there was still so much about being an organizer that led me to being erased or not building as intimate community as I could have built, because there's still this big piece of my identity that people are missing, that people are not hearing, are not witnessing, are not understanding, and that folks see as a consequence or a symptom of food deserts or of poverty, things like that, instead of recognizing my body as my body and also my experience as one that is marginal in the world. And so there is just like a lot of nuance there, because I have some of my closest friends today are people I met in 2014 through my organizing. And also a lot of those folks didn't have to grapple with fatness as an identity until recently, when they start taking my work more seriously. And so I think that is, just a very complex relationship to community, identity, and organizing.
And so we have a question to that. Submitted, what can queer spaces do to be less fat phobic, more inclusive for all queer and trans folk?
Yep. I think that this is another really complicated question, because I think that there are a lot of answers, but I also...
If you could start your sentence over, something happened with our audio on this end.
Oh, no, I was just saying, can you hear me now? Okay. I was just saying that I think that this is another complicated question, because I think that there are so many answers to this question. But what I also am going to name is that I think that the gist of all of those answers is that it's important for queer folks in queer space to understand, learn about, and really be able to define desire and desirability and desire capital that matters, because so much about the experiences of Black folks writ large, but Black fat folks in particular, is defined by desire, right? This libidinal economy, word to Jared Sexton and Frank Wilderson, like there's something very specific about our experiences that is predicated on desire in so many ways, right? Like if we take the work of Dr. Sabrina Strings seriously, and I do, so much of what she introduces us to in the introduction of her book is that anti-fatness as a coherent ideology comes from white Europeans who are like, we desire this body in this particular way on white women, but as it shows up on them, it looks gross, it looks disgusting, it looks, evil, it looks repulsive, it looks all this language that it looks dirty, that relates us to uncleanliness and therefore undesirability. And so I think that queer folks as a whole have to get a better handle on desire and desirability, and not as a way where you are politicizing, or rather, that's the wrong word to use, where you are making fat folks, political pawns in your like road to wokeness or whatever, but rather through building genuine relationship with fat folks and genuinely being interested in determining or building relationship with fat studies and fat scholarship that then teaches you about what desire is and why it's important to be engaging fat folks as whole individuals, and not as political pawns, and not just fat studies, but Black studies too. That's part of why I wrote this book as well, is that fat studies, I have decided that I'm coining a term for another discipline, and it's called Black Fat Studies. And it's important because it really bridges the gap between what fat studies and Black studies both are doing, that really gives way to a very specific group of people, and that being Black fat people.
So there is a question from our participants. Again, thank you to those who are engaged both in-house and online. While we have brought up, again, fatness in this last question answer, what needs to be done to change the narrative around fatness and to be more anti-fatness?
I don't think I understand the question. What needs to be done to change the narrative around fatness and be more? Yeah, I don't think I'm clear about the question.
All right, so we're gonna ask, again, we're doing live questions. So if that was your question, clarify it and I'll bring it back up again. Go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, so you just said desire capital, right? And so for me reading your book and seeing those words, desire capital, is this the word or the term that we have been looking for in place of pretty privilege? First part of the question. And then the second part of the question, on page 12 of your book, and I believe this is in chapter 2, you say that privilege is not quite specific enough and often does not go far enough. Desire is complex. Privilege insinuates that there's a possibility that you can opt out. And if you don't feel pretty, then you can't possibly benefit from the prettiness or suffer the violence of ugliness. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
So to answer the first part of your question, yes. I think that what people are trying to name with pretty privilege is more accurately named by desire capital. And to the second part of your question, what that really means is that when people use language like pretty privilege, I hate that language because I can't even say it. It's that they're trying to describe a very specific experience, but that oftentimes people who are told that they have this privilege, right? They understand like, well, if I don't feel pretty, I don't feel like I benefit from this experience. I don't feel like people treat me special or treat me in a particular way because of the way that I look. And now all of a sudden they don't have that privilege, right? Now all of a sudden they don't benefit from desirability. They don't benefit from beauty and prettiness as a politic. And so what I'm offering with Desire Capital, or what I'm hoping to offer with Desire Capital, is a much more clear understanding of the ways that desire is bought, traded, and exchanged as any other currency under this libidinal economy, right? That is our collective unconscious or our society, our world around us, right? One in which that we create and we sustain by the rules and privileges that we continually commit to. So that is to say that I think that a lot of times people do attempt to, because they don't take anti-fatness seriously, because they don't take desire seriously, that folks oftentimes will try to, you know, opt out of this thing, and in very similar ways to white people who will say, well, I'm poor, so I don't have any privileges, right? Or, you know, like I wanted this job and a Black person got this job over me, so what are my privileges, right? Very similar ways. People try to deny like the reality of this global structure. And I wanted to offer something different. I wanted to offer something that helped us understand desire as currency, as something to be bought, traded, and exchanged. And I don't think that pretty privilege does that for us. I think that it, in so many ways, trivializes the conversation and reduces it to, like I write in the book, you know, getting free drinks at a bar or getting a free bag of chips or something from a Mexican restaurant, and doesn't actually talk about the ways that people are dying because of desire, people are unemployed because of desire, people are houseless and homeless because of desire, right? People are without health care because of desire, people are without care at all because of desire. And so much about the construction of the world is, like I just named, produced by desire and desirability. And so I think desire capital gets to the heart of that, and in ways that pretty privilege just does not.
I appreciate that. If I nodded my head anymore, somebody in the audience was going to catch it, because I agree. There is currency in desirability, because you talk about how there's currency to be made in anti-fatness. You talk about, you know, and I appreciate the research you did, literally going back to these conglomerates of diet and weight loss industries. And some of your timeline pinpoint to very pivotal times in my life when I questioned my body. I tried to find identity and I didn't like it. And I was literally starving myself, right? Of a lot of things to fit a certain type of mode. So do you mind, for those who haven't read, let's talk about the currency that is made, the millions, on anti-fatness.
The billions. Yes. Diet culture, the diet industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? You know, your Weight Watchers and what used to be, you know, in the 2000s, Jenny Craig's and all of that, those are multi-billion-dollar industries that come from men, white men in particular, who were trying to control women and their sexual urges, right? So you have Sylvester Graham, who is the creator of the graham cracker, who who literally creates this recipe as a way to try to subdue women's urges to have sex, because he preferred abstinence, right? Like, and this becomes a big part of dieting and diet culture. Like, this is so much of what these industries are built on and built off of. And so now, right, in 2022, you have countless companies, you know, from commercial gyms to weight programs to all other types of programs that build their entire companies off the backs of fat hatred, right? Where the idea is to eradicate fatness, to eradicate quote unquote obesity, and to do so in a way that oftentimes is, one, unhealthy, but also not sustainable, right? You know, research shows us that 95 to 97% of the people who lose weight, gain that weight back, and then some, and oftentimes come back with severe health risks because of how unhealthy or how harmful, how unsafe their initial practices were when trying to lose that weight. But then beyond that, you also have, and this is a relevant conversation now, you know, in the 2000s, it was really big to talk about liposuction, and now we have conversations every day about BBLs. And, you know, I would love for people to interrogate what it says about the world in which we live, where people feel like in order to get any sort of structural advantages, even if they don't recognize that as the reasoning for why they're undergoing surgery, in order for them to get these structural advantages, they have to literally put their lives at risk to do so, right? We all know about how the dangers of these surgeries, partly because they are in so many ways so stigmatized, but also in many ways because they're just dangerous surgeries to have. And yet so many folks are willing to undergo those surgeries and risk their lives if it means getting structural benefits that they don't get because they are fat. And these are, again, million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industries that are built off of these very ideologies. And there's just something very peculiar and also really dangerous feels too soft of a word, but I'm going to use it anyway, but just something very dangerous about these practices and these industries that are in so many ways quite literally created solely to harm fat folks. And like I said before, in many ways as an attempt to quell the sexual urges of women. And for folks who don't really get that, Sylvester Graham's logic, and it's very illogical, is that if women are eating foods that are not good to them, right, that don't taste good, then they aren't going to want to have sex, right? It produces people who want to be abstinent. No logic, but that was the logic behind so much of this stuff that creates what we now understand to be diet culture. It's harmful, and it really does in so many ways just harm so many people.
I want to go back to the conversation about health for a second. In our book club, it was brought up about experiences that folks had throughout, schooling. So the mandatory PE test where you had to run a mile and you had to climb a rope that was suspended from the air, and with the healthism, which is going kind of busting like gangbusters now. And then I remember Michelle Obama's platform to to recreate what school lunches should be and make them more healthy. Can you talk more about why pushing health as opposed to or why pushing health when we're talking about, well, I'm worried about this fat person's health, or someone having to prove healthy in order for folks to kind of walk away from that?
I'll be honest and say I might need you to repeat your question in a second, because I stopped at Michelle Obama, because I just want everyone to know that Michelle Obama and her initiative, and while her husband was in office, was not about fat children and whether or not they were, able to live long, healthy lives. Her concern was being, and this is by her own admission, by the way, this is not me making this up, this is her words. Her concern was being able to make sure that the US was producing children who would be ready and able to join the military. She was interested in producing kids who could help further the US as an imperialist project. That was her focus. And the level of fat hatred, anti-fatness that came from her campaign, I think is something that we have yet to fully witness the depth of its harm. I think that she is going to be a huge reason for why we hear about a lot of adults in the coming future who develop eating disorders from their experiences in public schools. Because again, a lot of kids only got lunch and maybe breakfast when they went to school. And when those things changed, that also changed the lives of a lot of Black kids in particular, all for the sake of furthering the US as an imperialist project. So I had to say that. I'm sorry, Victoria.
My students know I say this all the time. Capitalism and imperialism are really the root of all evil. And so this is, I don't even remember my question because I'm just like,
Yeah.
to build it, okay. I think what my question was, can you talk a little bit about the healthism that is going around where folks are like, well, I'm, worried about this fat person's body because I just, I'm worried about health, or I'm working out all of the time, not because I'm fat phobic, but because I just want to be healthy. And why that is not only fat phobic, but that also, is ableist.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of the reason why I wrote chapter 3 of the book is because I really wanted to get to the heart of what health even is, right? I think that we use that language a lot, but people are not actually really able to define health. What is healthy? What is healthiness? Like what does it mean to be healthy? And what I wanted to do with that chapter was to be able to offer that. And when you do research on all of this, you find that so much about the origins of the medical industry, the origins of health as a practice in the US, is just another way to keep Black folks enslaved. That's literally it. It's just another way to punish Black folks for their bodies. And so then you start to contextualize that with modern practices, right? And you think about how often do people promote exercise as something to do for fun, as something to do for your body, and not as a punishment, right? Like, why do our bodies have to be punished in order for us to maintain this sort of ideal weight or this ideal size? Ideal to who? I don't know. But this ideal weight and this ideal size, why do we have to punish ourselves to get there? And then you read about Adolphe Quetelet, this white Belgian man who comes up with the BMI and does so as a way to measure the health of an entire population based solely off of the bodies of cis French men and European men, white men. And now all of a sudden, every Black person in the world who we know that our bodies do not look like that of French men and European men, now all have to be measured individually by this measurement that's produced for people who do not ever look like us and who we will never look like. And so I just have no investment in health as a concept because its very foundation is one that is anti-Black. My investment is in people feeling good in their bodies, however that looks for them, right? What does it look like for you to feel good in your body? And I think that has to be further complicated too, because I think a lot of folks would say, well, I feel good in my body when I look like this. But I think that idea is also informed by anti-fatness that tells us that there's no way for us to feel good in our bodies if we are fat. But that also makes clear that even if you do feel good in your body as a fat person, there are still advantages that you will not have, that you will be deprived of if you don't have this quote unquote gym body. So I think that now, like with all of this, all these conversations about health and wellness and BBLs and people sitting in the gym every 2 hours, right? Like there is just so much there that is constructed by, or that's informed by anti-fatness and anti-Blackness, that I think we don't get to the root of without interrogating the origins of health in the medical industry.
No, I definitely agree. And I appreciate, you bringing up, BBLs. This is not to attack or to any of that, but let's be real. There's a thin line between fat and thickness. Thickness has more desired capital than, fat. Like, how do you speak to that fine line of, again, what's thickness versus fatness? Why is there different acceptance rates for fatness depending upon how it's proportioned in one's body?
Yeah. I actually wrote an article about this. It was titled "The Conflict Between Thick versus Fat" in 2017. And literally that is all about that. It's about the fact that there is a particular currency in being thick that is not found in being fat, right? Where we now want the people with the quote unquote dad bods and the people who have their fatness proportioned on their bodies, that look a very particular way. And I think that it's the difference between someone who is classed, who's moneyed, and is safe versus someone who is poor and always already at risk of being murdered because of their size, right? In the piece that I wrote about, I drew a comparison. It's the difference between Winston Duke being praised for being M'Baku for his thickness and his thick thighs, and Eric Garner being murdered by New York police, right? Like, it's the difference between, and the piece I wrote about at the time, one of the really big moments was like thick Beyonce was getting thicker, Rihanna was getting thicker. It's the difference between, those two, right, being celebrated for their bodies, and Roxanne Gay having to undergo surgery because of hers, right? Like there's just a staunch difference between the ways that fatness is engaged versus thickness that must be really much more deeply interrogated if we're going to be honest about how people are showing up in the world and why we make decisions that we do.
No, I definitely appreciate that. And I appreciate, the policing of the fat body, right? And that could go in several different avenues, right? Policing how we treat it, what we put into it, how we proportion the fat. But since you did mention, Eric Garner, I, again, equally appreciated how you discussed the policing of fat Black bodies. If you want to go into that a little bit, please do.
Ooh, yes, just a little bit. I'll say that Chapter 4 for me was a very, very, very important chapter and was also a really hard chapter. Again, I wrote this book in the midst of uprisings. So I was writing about George Floyd while we were also in the streets being shot at by police. But it was important for me to write that chapter because the book itself was going to be solely about that topic at first. When I was first approached about writing a book in 2018, I was going to write it about that topic specifically. And that changed as I developed more of an analysis around anti-fatness and anti-Blackness and just have more to say. But that chapter was very important for me because I think that because of how removed fatness as an identity is from movement and organizing, a fat analysis is so deeply removed from police murders. And I think that does us a huge disservice because it removes a complete portion of this conversation that's so important, because people don't have an analysis on fatness and on anti-fatness. And so I wrote that chapter to sort of give people language to understand why it is that so many of the men and boys that you were seeing on your TV screens were fat. Why, like the significance of what that means in the years between 2014 and 2020, where so many of the names that we saw on our TV screens, whose deaths we saw playing on repeat, why so many of them were fat or larger in size, and why their health then came into question to determine, or to justify rather, their murders. And so we've done significant work on the fact that so many of the men, or so many of the people whose deaths we saw on screen were men, right? We know about misogyny, we know about patriarchy and the ways that Black women are removed completely oftentimes from these conversations. So I didn't want to do that work with the book because for me, it was important to stick with what I wanted to talk about in terms of fatness and masculinity. But it was very important for me to be able to make clear about why the names that we did see on our screens were people who were fat, and what that meant in the grand scheme of things with regards to fatness, policing, and Blackness.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me? All right. In our book club discussion, we talked a lot about this chapter, which is entitled Black, Fat, and Policed. And we were talking about George Floyd and how we know that his murder was because of a police officer kneeling on his neck. And when you think about the size of the police officer or the size of George Floyd, thinking about how that could have also served as a justification of like, well, this is the only way that I'm going to be able to apprehend a person of this size, and how that ties so much into how fat people are spoken to, how fat people are handled physically. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, that very logic is exactly what the lawyers, the attorneys, and the medical examiners who were defending Eric Garner's murderers used. They quite literally said a bear hug could have killed him. Those are their words, right? Like, they used this idea that there was only one way to tame. And I use this language very, very intentionally in the book. There's only one way to tame someone of their size. And that oftentimes is through murder, it's through euthanization. It is to say that from Eric Garner to George Floyd and all the names in between, that these people are beasts, right? These people are animals who must be put down because they're disruptive, right? Because they're dangerous, because they are animalistic, right? And because they are already a danger to society because they're fat anyway, right? So what use do they have in the world if they're already fat? So that justifies them killing us, that justifies our murder by police. And this is language that folks use for Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, George Floyd, Walter Scott, right? Alton Sterling. So many of these names are people whose bodies, whose size, whose weight, whose health conditions were used as justification for their murders. And so that is where the analogy, you know, belly of the beast comes from, is that there is something very particular about the ways that our bodies are witnessed as and understood to be things to be euthanized, beastly things to be euthanized, to be put down, deserving of punishment by death, because we are always and already seen as hyper-violent and disruptive.
Definitely. In an interview with the Black Agenda Report, when asked how your book could aid readers in understanding the current social and political climate, you said, "Belly of the Beast seeks to walk the reader through the interrelated nature of this anti-Black, anti-fat violence, to name that fatness is not separate from Blackness, but rather both are predicated on the animality assigned to these modes of being, rendering them one and the same." So as a fat Black person myself, I read this and I almost started praise dancing. I was like, points are being made. So thank you for that. In the book, you talk about subjugation, and you use that word very specifically when referring to the power structure that fat bodies and therefore fat people are scrutinized by, and also experience violence. Subjugation literally means brute force. Why is it so important that we use that language when speaking about this violence?
Yes. Oh my goodness. I love this question. I think that it's really important to use language like subjugation, because I think that it is what gets to the heart of exactly what that violence is, right? It is, like you said, it means brute force. It's exactly what I'm trying to name by being clear about the fact that Black fat folks, or the Black fat as I affectionately refer to us as in the book, are people who must experience this violence, right? The very nature of our being as being named as Black and fat is to say that we are deserving of experiencing this violence, and that our bodies are required to experience this violence for the maintenance of whiteness, for the maintenance of anti-Blackness, for the maintenance of thinness as a politic. And so subjugation is very important to sort of name the ways that we are formed into objects, right, objectified, and are also simultaneously being forced, right, to endure a particular level of violence because of the ways that we are experiencing what Zakiya Iman-Jackson calls this human animality, or what Saidiya Hartman calls this slave humanity, where we're sort of like existing in limbo, right? Existing in this in-between space where we're removed from humanity, but also are afforded just enough of it to be able to tame us, to be able to subjugate us, to be able to force us into slavehood, into slaveness, and to be able to create the conditions where Blackness becomes coterminous with slaveness, if we're using language from Frank Wilderson. And so that's why I think that language is so important to use, because I think it gets to the heart of exactly what experience I'm trying to name.
And one more question before we open it up to audience participation. I just want to make sure that we're tapping in on each of these 6 chapters. to talk more about the Black trans experience in particular, for those of you who may not be aware, so in order to have sometimes gender affirming surgeries, the first thing that someone is told is that they have to lose a certain amount of weight, or they have to be at a certain weight in order to receive gender affirming surgery. Can you talk about how that then brings gender into the conversation?
Yeah. So yes, a lot of times fat trans mass folks, if they do get to have gender affirming surgeries, oftentimes end up paying 2 or 3 times as much as their thin counterparts. And because we know that fat folks oftentimes are without health care, because fat folks are oftentimes unemployed, that means that money comes out of their own pockets, which most times doesn't happen because fat folks are also more likely to be poor, or through fundraising. And so, yes, there is, there's something very particular about the ways that fatness disrupts gender, but also that because of the way that gender is constructed as something that is in so many ways specifically for thin people, fatness becomes its own gender, but not as something that is affirming, right? Because I understand gender to be violent, but as something that is inherently exclusionary, right? The purpose of it is that, like, you are not able to fit into this sort of paradigm of man or woman, and you are not allowed to have these surgeries that affirm that for you. And so you're forced into this gendered experience that is fatness, that sort of further contextualizes who you are in the world, or how the world shows up or does not show up for you. That's just very specific, and that is, I think, very particular, especially when it comes to Black fat folks, Black fat trans folks. So I'm currently in the process of finishing a chapter for an anthology that will come out soon, called Anti-Blackness, Gender, and Fat. And I'm writing specifically about the ways that, specifically about this question. So I don't want to say too much, but there's something very important for us to interrogate when talking about gender and fatness and Blackness, because there is something very particular about the ways that gender functions as a sort of segment or as a piece of anti-Black violence that, as we know, is coterminous with anti-fatness and anti-fat violence. And that's just one iteration of it. There's also this piece where a lot of fat Black folks are not able to find binders that accurately fit them or that appropriately fit them, right? That a lot of fat folks, again, like I mentioned earlier, don't have health insurance because they're also unemployed, right? That it's like this cyclical form of violence that oftentimes leaves people out of their ability to be cared for in a very particular way, because that's how gender is constructed, and that's what gender is supposed to operate as.
Thank you for that. Again, getting back to the book, another technique of yours that I think readers appreciate is how the flow of your book, how you build, right? How you break down, you give examples, you introduce, you break down and give examples. In your last chapter, you talk about beyond abolition, right? And so we've had various questions, well, what do? We want to help. How do you create better? How do you create, spaces that doesn't stumble into all the things you talk about? And then, we hear, well, you abolish it, right? And that term has been, I guess, repopularized when talked about police enforcement. But can you talk about it in the framework of how you discuss it in your book? What does it mean to, beyond abolition?
Yeah. For me, right, like you said, it oftentimes, or it has been repopulated in so many ways to mean that we want to abolish police, right? And really, it's become synonymous with defunding police in so many ways. And those things are things that we do want to do and that are important. But abolition cannot stop with police alone, right? There's so much about policing and prisons that like show up so much outside of just police unions or rather police departments and literal prisons. And so for me, what I write about is, and what I use a lot of the language of, is destroying the world, which is a very particular Afro-pessimist demand. And I'm using demand very specifically because I think that oftentimes people are searching for solutions. And I think that what I wanted to make clear in that chapter, but in the book as well, was that I'm not invested in making solutions so much as I'm invested in making a demand of the world. And I think that whatever solutions we come to are solutions that we come to together. I think that we're already experiencing a world wherein just a few people made decisions and now we are here where we are. And so my investment is in making a demand, and that demand is destroying the world. And I think that, you know, Dr. Joy James, who I love, she gave a talk at Brown University where she sort of responded to a question like this. And she says that, you know, it's an impossible task, but it's one worthy of us. And for me, that was so affirming, because it's like, yes, this is why this is a demand and not a solution, because it is an impossible task, but it's one that's worthy of us. But then I always take it a step further than that, where I am thinking that, to me, possible and impossible are things that are determined by what is and is not intelligible, which is to say that it's determined by what the human psyche can and cannot understand. But if we agree that Black folks are experiencing this human animality or this slave humanity, where they're positioned outside of this hegemonic human experience, then perhaps it's not so much impossible, but that it's something that can only happen if we make it happen, right? Because and we can only make it happen if we start to understand this outside of what has been made intelligible by the human, right? Like, which is to say, what if we stop thinking about this in ways that white people think about this? What if there is another way for us to understand destroying the world or world destruction, or to understand moving beyond abolition to create this experience that happens beyond the world in which we live, that's only not understandable or not understood or only feels impossible because we are thinking of it through this intelligibility. And that's just a question that I ponder on a lot. I don't have an answer yet, but I think that that's something to always consider too. And so, yeah, that's sort of how I talk about it, how I frame it in the book.
No, that's good, because you even introduce people thinking about, you know, to deconstruct or to abolish something. It's not to end, right? People are like, you take it away and then what? Well, there's replacement, right? And you're saying everyone can be a part of that decision making for what you replace it with, but to say something ends, it does not denote that there's a beginning, right? And so
Right.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate that that's the way that you ended your book. You know, sometimes in your reading literature of this, not even subject matter, but just talking about the isms, right? Sometimes you often feel like, oh, well, now what? You know, like we've named everything wrong and there's nothing left. But I appreciate that something else can be rebirthed. There's a need for it. And so I'm super appreciative of that. And on the tail end of that comment, I want to ask you, after writing your first book, you know, after spilling your own personal experiences, you've interviewed people, after putting that on page, what did you do? Because it's a lot. It's a lot for readers. You evoked a lot of emotions from me as a reader. So I only imagine what it felt like after the last period was made. What did that look like for Deshaun?
One, thank you. And two, yes, it is a lot. So after the last period, of course, there was like revisions and edits and things like that. So when it was finally done, I think I took off from work for like a month, I think. I don't even know if it was a month or not, but I quit one of my jobs. I took off from the other job for at least a few weeks. Because I didn't write. I didn't read. I didn't do anything that was like a part of my normal day-to-day because I was exhausted. You know, like part of that was because I was writing in the midst of all that I explained earlier, but it's also just exhausting writing a book. And I needed a moment away from all of the research and the writing and everything else. But then also I was doing a lot of speaking engagements leading up to the release of the book. And so it was also like, okay, I can't stop reading for too long. Can't stop writing for too long because, you know, there's things to be done. But yeah, I took a really lengthy break after I was finally finished, where I was like, I just want a moment to Deshaun. Like I want to just be to self for a moment. And that was what I did.
Another audience question that we have is, ooh, this was a good one. Okay. What tips do you have for how to appropriately address obesity as a health issue when there are students in the class who are fat? How do you do so in a way that's not isolating these folks?
I don't think of obesity as a health issue, so I don't have any advice for that. Yeah, I don't health is not a health, or obesity is not a health issue. In fact, obesity, if folks read the book, chapter 5 makes clear that obesity as an epidemic is in fact something that is a government funded project, wherein government scientists like the CDC and the media were able to create a narrative about fat folks that benefited them and harmed us, and that continues to harm us. So I don't have any advice for that besides not doing it.
Fair enough. Another question from the audience. What are some major takeaways you want to leave this audience and readers with? What are some of the ways that people can go about changing the narrative?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing for me, like if people don't get anything else from this talk, don't get anything else from the book, the most important thing for me is that people understand exactly how coterminous anti-fatness and anti-Blackness really are, exactly how much these two structures produce each other, exactly how harmful it is then for fat Black folks in particular, and that there is no way to talk about Black liberation, fat liberation, freedom of any kind if there is not a mention or a clear understanding of anti-fatness and / as anti-Blackness. That's the most important thing for me. And I hope that people will hear these talks that I give, read the book, listen to the book, whatever, however they engage the book, and then decide to do more research, right? I cite a lot of people in the book. I think I was very generous with citations on purpose, because I think there's just so much to read and so many people to read. And so I hope that people take that seriously and decide that they're going to, move the conversation forward by doing their own research beyond the book, and being able to have exact conversations like this.
One audience member asked, have you experienced anti-fatness, anti-Blackness, or a combination thereof in vegan and or environmentalist spaces?
Not personally, because I don't exist in any vegan or environmentalist spaces on purpose. But I do have a lot of friends who at one point were environmentalists. And so I know like about that general experience. And of course, I also am on Twitter, and sometimes if you're on Twitter, you know that the Twitter vegans can be really, they be a lot. So I have experienced that, right, where there's a lot of general anti-fatness with regards to veganism, where people believe that veganism is the answer to quote unquote obesity, that veganism is the thing that will do away with fatness, and that environmentalism, specifically when talking about environmental racism or environmental anti-Blackness, that, you know, like I named earlier, that fatness is a symptom of food deserts and environmental racism, instead of understanding, you know, these things to be a contributor to the violence that fat Black poor folks experience, and not understanding it as a symptom of our bodies.
Since you've brought up Twitter, in the last 2 weeks, there was an uproar when a blogger and writer tweeted something to the effect of one of the beauty influencers that we have seen on YouTube is now changing their entire platform to be about fitness. And this person retweeted or quote tweeted, which is to say, when you share someone's post on your own page and then also add your own commentary, that it shouldn't be about them, and that any hate that is then reflected toward them is something that they're deserving. And from this conversation came terminology that I could not believe was formed, and that was that fat people are fit phobic. Can you tell us your thoughts about that?
So I want to say first that the person who made the initial tweet is a dear friend of mine. And it is frustrating witnessing the ways that thin people will use any opportunity that they can to harass fat Black folks, fat Black women in particular, especially if they are, you know, of a marginal, a more marginal experience. So I want to say that first, just to say that I love her and am always on her side. But yes, I did see the whole debacle with fit phobia, and I don't think I tweeted much outside of like LOL at that being a word, because like, no way you believe that that's a real thing. Like it was just, I just couldn't believe it. So what actually, what it has become in my friend group is that we talk about it like fit phobia is, you know, the disliking of someone's outfit. You know, like if somebody's outfit is ugly, that I'm fit phobic, like, cause why you have that on? So that, so I am fit phobic because people be wearing some ugly outfits. And that's what I understand fit phobia to be.
I had to ask because I saw that and it was utter nonsense. And for those of you wondering, I did not mention the name of the original poster or the person who violently shared the thing, because for me, I don't want any more added into that space, but also the original poster, their work has been transformative as well. And I hope to bring them here to talk to you all about that.
Well, I hope you can get her. I love her. And if I can help make that happen, I will.
First of all, yeah, sorry. First, I must turn off my mic on the fit phobic because that was a good playing on words. So I appreciate the comedian in you. We have a live question again. Special thanks to our participants again in person and virtually that are hanging out with us. This person asks, can you talk a bit about the intersections of Blackness and fatness in medical fields and medical context?
So yes, I think that so much about what we have been talking about actually is very specific to medical fields, right? When talking about Black fat trans folks who can't have gender affirming surgeries because of their size, I think that's very specific to the medical field. I think that diet culture is very specific to the medical field, specifically when it comes to dietitians and nutritionists, who are oftentimes employed because of anti-fatness. And I think that, there's something very, 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 very sinister about the ways that fat Black folks are treated in doctors' offices. I'll give an anecdotal response to this because it just reminded me of a recent doctor experience that I had. I went to the doctor recently trying to find a new primary care physician, and not the primary doctor, but her assistant. He, ran a bunch of tests on me and found that, that all of my numbers came back regular and fine and normal, whatever all this means, right? But he also saw that I have a very specific BMI that is well over the ideal BMI for the ideal size of someone my age. And he asked me, he was like, do you know what BMI is? And of course I laughed, like, yes, if only you knew who I was, I do know what BMI is. But then he was like, well, I think that if right now you are obese, and I think that if you worked out and chose to lose weight, you would feel more confident in yourself. And I was like, I don't remember at any point in this appointment where I mentioned that I wasn't confident in who I am. So that's a little confusing for me. And also, like, I don't know why a medical doctor is talking about confidence. You're not my therapist, right? Like, I have a therapist. You know her, she referred me to you. It was just a very interesting dynamic when he was like, well, yeah, but I just mean, like, I think that you would feel better in your body. But I'm like, but you just told me that my blood pressure is fine, my cholesterol is fine, like all these things are okay. So what indicates that I'm not feeling good in my body, right? Like, what is telling you that my body is punishing me or that I don't feel well in my body? But also, if there was, right, I came here to find a primary care physician. Are doctors unable to treat someone who is disabled? Right? Like, because I am disabled. So there are certain things that are not fine with my body, right? I have a heart condition. But if the primary things that you check for to determine whether or not somebody is in risk or at risk of dying or whatever, right, are okay, why, like, what does it look like to talk about confidence then in that context? It didn't make sense. But this is an experience that I've had many times in my life, and that so many fat folks experience in doctors' offices, where it doesn't matter what we go into the doctor for, we always end up being spoken to about our weight, right? Our size. Nothing else matters in that conversation besides what the scale says. And because of that, so many, like, it is statistically proven that a lot of folks, fat folks, are dying from being misdiagnosed or undiagnosed, because our experiences in the doctor's office is focused on our weight and not the issue that's happening in our body. And so that is just a very particular experience that I think it's always important to talk about, because there is, the medical field is killing fat people by choosing to not understand anti-fatness, by choosing to not understand fatness as an identity, right? Something that is, for many people, just innate to their size, to their body. And by choosing to not interrogate the general anti-Blackness of the medical field, that leads so many of us to our deaths in a very unfortunate manner. So that was just like a quick little story from my recent experience to talk about the ways that so many fat folks experience just a lot of harm from doctors who often remind us that they take oaths to do no harm, and yet they do the harm every single day.
A question from one of our audience members said, could you speak to how the concept of passing as a trans person, so someone being cisgender assumed, relates to the way anti-fatness, anti-Blackness, and transness all intersect?
Yes, so I think that a lot of the ways that trans folks are requested or coerced into passing oftentimes is about moving them closer to whiteness. And I'm saying them because I have not had any surgeries and haven't made any changes to my body. But I'm talking specifically about trans folks who undergo medical surgeries and gender affirming surgeries. A lot of times it's about undergoing a lot of different procedures to be able to feel comfortable in their body, but also in many ways to support this idea that there is a particular way to look. And that look is what is closer in proximity to whiteness. And what that does for a lot of fat folks is that it says, well, if I'm too fat for gender affirming surgeries, right, then how am I supposed to fit into this category of being cis assumed or whatever it may be? But then also, what is the purpose of being cis assumed, right? We know that to be trans in a cis sexist world, a transphobic world, is a violent experience. We know that. But what is the purpose of being cis assumed outside of the structural benefits that it holds, right? And so I think that what I'm petitioning folks to do in chapter 6 of the book is to consider that, like, there are some cis men who have larger chests, right? That not all cis men are muscular people. And so if that is true, then there is no one ideal look for a man. And also, there doesn't have to be an ideal look for a man anyway, even if that was not true, because we know that the ways that gender is constructed is one that is always already violent anyway, right? So in so many ways, I think that we are required to consider the ways that these standards for what passing is supposed to look like, for what cis assumption is supposed to look like, really just recapitulates or reproduces, reifies this understanding that there is an ideal look for a man or a woman, and that only reproduces the very same anti-Black, very same colorist, very same anti-fat, very same, like transphobic violences that so many people face. There are so many of our trans sisters, trans brothers, trans siblings who, will never be able to see the inside of an operation room, right, who deserve to also be affirmed in their body. So many of our siblings who are forced into sex work, who are forced into identifying against their actual identity in order to survive on the streets, right, who also deserve to be affirmed in their bodies and in their gender. And when we start to talk about passing or who is and is not passing or what it means to pass, it's like the only thing that defines passing is an anti-Black white supremacist structure, right? This language that says that someone has to look a very particular way in order to be understood as a woman or a man. And that also is very violent for a lot of non-binary people who don't move away from gender or sex assigned to them at birth, who are still trans, right? And so it's just there's a lot of violence is there that does play a significant role in the overlap of anti-fatness, cis-sexism or transphobia, and anti-Blackness with regards to gender and transness.
Definitely appreciate that. And I hate that time is winding down, right? I feel like we all could sit here all day. We know the work of an activist is never done. You know, there was a quote, you know, the rent I pay for living here is to be an activist. So if allowed, I think this last question, very befitting, how do you stay motivated? You know, how do you stay motivated to fight for change? There's so many systems of oppression, and I don't say there's so many systems. I think there's some very concrete systems. They just evolve, right? They learned ways to oppress per the time period. So the question at hand as we sadly close out, how do you stay motivated?
So two things. One, I want to say I did see from someone else that there was a question about whether or not the book will be translated to Spanish. I want to say that we are working on it, and that there's a lot of like red tape in making that happen. But yes, we are working on having the book translated to Spanish first, and hopefully other languages too. But there's been a lot of requests for a Spanish translation, so we're working on it. But to your question, staying motivated is hard a lot of times, right? It's sometimes I think that you do the work that you do and it starts to feel helpless in very particular ways. Helpless and hopeless, but I think that what helps me is being surrounded by people who are committed to this politic too, right? Because I think having community that shares your politic, that shares your understanding of the world, at least for me, helps me to be able to be like, you know what, I need a moment, but I know that there will always be room to catch up because I will always have my folks who are committed with me, right? So you take your moments, you take your breaks, you take you step away for a bit, and then you return to the people who love you, to the people who hold you, to the people who care for you, and hopefully those people are also the people who are holding and providing grace for the politic that you share, the politic that you are actively working through, and that matters, and that starts to shape how you show up in the world. So that is my motivation, my folks, the folks who love me and the folks who I love back, and the hope that, and I'm using hope loosely, but maybe it's the more accurate word is the desire to see something different, to witness something else. I think all those things together definitely keep me motivated.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Much appreciation to Grace, right? I think that we all need to extend grace both internally and externally as we are all, using our time while we're here as best we can according to our set definitions. So again, I did the welcome. Again, your presence was welcomed, and now I thank you. Your presence was felt virtually. You have definitely awakened not only my mind, but the minds that were here. And I can't wait to see what you put out next. And again, thanks to Victoria for my first multimedia interview. People are everywhere. I don't know where to look, but super, super, super grateful for you. And again, thank you for Victoria to have both the boldness and the inviting spirit for us as the libraries to partner with this. So I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And again, Deshawn's book, this is what it looks like. This is a magnificent cover. If you want to tell, if there's a story behind this, oh my gosh, because it is beautiful. But it's called Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness. You can buy it anywhere books are sold, but we love independent bookstores. So if you can find an independent bookstore, our favorite here in Greensboro is definitely Scuppernong. And if you can find a Black-owned independent bookstore, that's even better, okay? We also are really excited that there is now an audiobook version, which Deshawn reads themselves. Can't wait to do that. And because we want to have all of this as accessible to as many people as possible, so it's on Audible, it's on Libro FM, and you can also get the Libby app and check out both the book and the audiobook from your library. So thank you so much. And for those of you who are like, my question didn't get answered, or I want to have more conversation about this, again, this is but part one. Deshawn will be here in person at some point in April. If you follow our Office of Intercultural Engagement here at UNCG on Instagram and TikTok, we go where the people are, UNCG_OIE. Also, if you go to our website, which is intercultural.uncg.edu, you can get the information as soon as it comes out. We are so excited, Deshawn, that you honored us with your presence and to have this deep, vulnerable conversation. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors. I cannot wait to continue this conversation and to do more around this topic. Thank you so much, and thank all the participants for their very thoughtful questions and for also bearing with some of our technical difficulties, because although it is year 3 with Ms. Rona, we're still figuring it out. So thank you for that.
I just want to say thank you to both of you, to everyone who showed up, to everyone who asked questions. I am very excited to get there in April, and I'm looking forward to figuring out the details and the dates and all the things, and hoping and praying that Miss Rona just stays wrapped up for a bit so I can get there and get back. But yeah, just thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all again soon.
Thank you. And you all will also be receiving this recording via the email addresses that you all have registered with. And for our in-person folks, you'll be receiving that as well, because we want to make sure that we're making things as accessible as possible in this conversation. So be on the lookout for that, as well as a feedback form, because we want to know how we did, how we can make this better for you all, but also what are you looking forward to talking with Deshawn when they are here again in April. So thank you so much, and good night, everyone.